What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for the Riftbreaker. But a few things to get out of the way at the start of the video here. I review games after 100% all the time, mostly to set me apart from other reviewers and content creators on YouTube here. And while that does include the achievements, it also includes more than the achievements. If you're new to the channel and go to my channel page, the first video you'll see is a video explaining everything that I cover. My Steam profile is also public and listed in the description below. Feel free to check that out. And one last thing before we dive into this is that I did do a sponsored video for this game a few weeks ago for its DLC launch, The Metal Terror. However, the reviews themselves would never be sponsored, of course, but just to throw that out there, I did do that sponsored video previously. From there, let's actually dive into this thing. The Riftbreaker overall is a pretty interesting title that blends elements from different genres. We see elements of ARPGs as well as real-time strategy games with base building, that type of stuff. And we can do that in one of two game modes, either survival or campaign. Campaign is obviously the story, whereas survival mode limits you to one biome or map, if you will, and your goal is to survive the time period, which then completes the mode. Now, for campaign mode, the plot setup is relatively straightforward. We are playing as a scientist that is sent to a planet known as Galatea 37 to essentially start terraforming it and getting it ready for human occupation. We do this via a mech suit, which is helping us build all of the things that we need and do the appropriate research to build a rift station, which is what will allow the travel to the new planet and actually start colonizing it. However, this takes a ton of resources. Moreover, all of this building is upsetting the local wildlife who are constantly attacking your base and you have to defend yourself. Now, I will tell you, relatively straightforward campaign. It pretty much goes in the direction you would expect it to. There are two distinct endings for the title, and that's pretty much decided with a choice right at the end, so there's not going to be like branching arcs or anything, but with a relatively gameplay-focused title that wasn't really expected to begin with. But overall, the plot is okay. I wouldn't say it's anything to write home about, but it's not bad. Now, in terms of our character progression, this boils down to research. So as you build through the campaign, you'll get access to various buildings, which will then facilitate your research. Research affects your base as well as your actual character and the things you have available to craft. Now, a lot of these systems are interwoven pretty deeply, but there are a few different research trees, one for your actual character, one for your base, and then a third one that focuses on more alien type stuff. But again, there's actually, even with this distinction, still a lot of interplay between these systems. For instance, some of the base research you can do will give you access to ammunition depots and ammunition building, which will then affect your character's reload speed in terms of the ammo available to them. Just to give an example, but the character research tree, if you will, often gives you access to crafting schematics, which will then allow you to craft new types of weapons with the various resources you are building up to build your actual base with. You'll then also be able to use some of those to craft various items, which will affect your playstyle as well as upgrade your mech. Which brings us naturally into the base building. Now, if you've ever played a base building type game, you'll basically get the gist of it here. You need to gather resources, then use those resources to then facilitate more building, which unlocks more research, and it's all kind of interwoven into a fun system that kind of builds off of each other. Buildings will upgrade, giving you access to better and better defenses, as well as better and better types of research or supplies, which will allow you to do more and more things. Now, I will tell you, on the negative side of this, it does lead to a bit of a menu hell, honestly. There's just a lot of menus to cycle through, and as the game progresses, more and more just gets layered on, and it does kind of make you want to just have a cleaner UI at some point. But from there, let's talk gameplay a little bit. So as I mentioned, there are two modes, but regardless of which one of those modes you're in, the core concept is the same. You're going to set up and defend your base. Now, in the campaign specifically, you are not just limited to the starting map, but rather you're actually going to need to gather all sorts of resources to build the rift station, which is going to lead you to other maps around the planet. So once you get to a certain point in the story, you'll build a building that will then allow you to travel to other parts of the planet via rifts, which will then take you to other biomes. Each of these biomes will have unique things going on in terms of the actual resources you need to gather there, as well as the occasional side quest like what's going on with the local fauna, that type of stuff. Moreover, the biomes typically have unique environmental conditions that will affect the gameplay. For instance, there is a volcano biome that will, be very hot and you have to find a way to deal with that. Sometimes this can be mitigated through various research available to you that will then allow you to take care of it. For instance, in the desert biome, the radiation there is a problem and will destroy your buildings, so you have to research protection for your buildings there, which brings us to building. So across these different maps you have access to, you can of course build on the new ones. However, what you're going to build here is usually an outpost that allows you to gather resources there and then send them back to your main headquarters, if you will. So while building still occurs on these other maps, it's not quite to the extent that it will on the main map, which acts as your main base of operations. And while you're doing all of this, you're going to be kind of learning about the planet, which brings us to the DLC side campaign. Now, no spoilers here, but once you get to a certain point in the main campaign, the DLC, if you have it, will open up a second branch of the story, if you will, that you can kind of follow through and do on the side in a new biome. And I mention this specifically because this particular DLC has a much more interesting story than the main plot, in my opinion, and also adds things like new enemies, etc. Now, while you're doing all of this, your base will occasionally come under attack, as I mentioned, by all the various creatures around. So you'll have to build your base's defenses in the form of various types of turrets, which will then hit the enemy. And then, of course, with you controlling a specific unit, you can get in there and engage in some more action-oriented combat, which is honestly a lot of fun. There's a good amount of weapon variety and ways to approach this, and then there are various enemies who do various types of things, such as the artillery beasts, which can be really annoying as you don't have a lot of ways to hit them long range at first, but then later you can get things like artillery turrets, which can take care of them for you. But the combat itself is a lot of fun, and that's probably the core thing to think about when it comes to Riftbreaker, is that while it's not the biggest title in the world, the actual gameplay loop of building your base and then fending off these various types of alien life forms, it's just a lot of fun, especially the actual combat. But that said, I would tell you that the enemy variety does get pretty stale pretty quick. There's really only a handful of enemy types. The DLC does help with this a little bit. It introduces some new ones. However, broadly speaking, the types of enemies you're going to be engaging with is relatively tame. Now, all of that said, we're going to move on to positives and negatives, as the Riftbreaker is a indie title. There's not quite as much to go over as there would normally be for these reviews. So let's go ahead and talk positives and negatives. On the positive side of things, the game, especially the actual combat, is very fun. All the various weapons you can attach, like such as flamethrowers, fist weapons, various swords, spears, grenade launchers, rocket launchers, all that types of stuff. The combat is just fun to engage with. Another positive is that there is a world editor, so you can actually adjust various things in the world, like the difficulty, the rate of enemies actually attacking you, that type of stuff. But there's also a campaign editor, so you can actually jump in here and kind of build your own maps and make your own missions, that type of stuff. So that stuff is there. It's a lot of fun to mess around with. Which leads us to our last positive, and that is that this game blends a couple genres into something unique and really fun as a result. But on the negative side of things, for starters, the UI is pretty rough. Again, this gets kind of worse as you go, but there's just so many menus and everything to keep track of that it can be a real drag trying to just remember where everything is and everything that you need to do. And the campaign is pretty good at going step by step in terms of this, but there is just a kind of nonsense amount of menus and stuff to remember in terms of just where everything is. And then from there, the enemy variety itself does get a little stale. Again, this is something the DLC does help with, actually, as it added a little bit of enemy variety, but even still, there's just not enough there to be like, oh, there's new stuff to fight here and there. And you will fight the occasional like big boss type of enemy, but after a while, you've just kind of seen what the game has to offer and throw at you in this regard. And then last but not least, the biggest negative right now. I would tell you before I jump into this that this is something the dev team is actively working on, and that is the lack of multiplayer. This is the type of game that just screams for a multiplayer mode. And it is in development. That's something they're working on right now. You can go to their Steam page. They have things talking about it. But right now, that's not in the game, so I can't really count it. But it is nonetheless a negative. This is the type of game that I think just really, really needs a multiplayer mode. Now, that said, whether or not that turns out to just be a co-op mode or rather a competitive multiplayer, we shall see. But this is the type of game I could see people having a ton of fun with in a competitive fashion when it comes to multiplayer. So I hope they'll consider adding that, as that's probably my biggest negative for this game, is that while you're playing through and doing all this stuff, you can't help but feel like it could really benefit from that specific feature. And that's from someone who primarily plays single-player games. But nonetheless, that brings us to our conclusion. Overall, the Riftbreaker is a fantastically fun experience that blends a lot of genres together into something pretty unique. But more than anything, it's just fun, which is something that I think some games forget to be sometimes, frankly. Which means that for the game's asking price of $30 over on Steam, I think that's more than a fair price, and you'll get a lot of fun out of it for that. But there you guys go. Hope you enjoyed the review. If you did, remember to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.